Sara Kehaulani Goo, Editor-in-Chief at Axios. Thank you for still being here. I hope you've been energized by this afternoon. Just a quick reminder for those who are watching us online, I encourage you to follow us on Twitter and use that hashtag #What'sNextSummit. And now, I'm super pleased to introduce our next guest. She's the President and CEO of TIAA, Thasunda Brown Duckett. Welcome, Thasunda.
Thank you. It's so great to be here live and in person.
I know. We've been enjoying it. I want to get right into it because you have such an interesting personal story. You are one of only 2 Black women running a Fortune 500 company in 2022, which is pretty amazing. Thank you. So a lot of people are looking at your leadership, and you have an interesting personal story that I think informs what you do. I've heard you talk about how your father worked at Xerox for a very long time, and then when it came for him to retire, you learned that he didn't have enough money to retire, and he hadn't saved enough. And I'm dying to ask you, I mean, that must inform so much of what you do and how you lead one of the biggest financial institutions that helps people save for retirement. So I'd love for you to tell us about that.
Well, it's so great to be here, and we're just going to jump right into the personal story. I'm sure all of us can relate to knowing that your parents do the best they can financially, and sometimes their best is insufficient. And then all the work and sacrifice that they have provided, especially my parents, Otis and Rosie Brown, enabled me to go to college, graduate, and then come home. And you have that conversation with your parents. Somehow we got on money. And I saw my father's statement. And when the daughter has to tell the father that you don't have enough to think about retiring, I didn't know I was going to be a CEO of a Fortune 100 company at that time. I was making around $26,000. But the fact that my father didn't have enough, what was really disturbing is that he never contributed to his 401k. This is a man who worked for over 40 years. And to know that there was something for him that would match his contribution, when all of his life he worked hard to provide for his children, that was a hit different. And so when you say, how has that shaped my leadership? It's in a real profound way. It shaped me in understanding the character from which I was raised. That my father told me to reach for the moon because even if I missed, I would be among the stars. And I get to do that, even when there are ceilings that you have to bust through. It taught me empathy because he did the best that he could, but he didn't have the right information, the right connection, the right level of wherewithal to do better, even though he wanted better. And so as a leader, when I think about financial inclusion, when I think about financial equity, I think about my father. And that drives me to ask the second, the third, the fourth question. Not to say, do we have something on the shelf? Do we have great benefits? But who's participating and who's not participating? How are we communicating in a way that someone like Otis Brown can see that that benefit is for him and ultimately allow someone like Otis Brown to have a better future? And so I get the privilege to lead a company where every day I wake up and I think about Otis Brown. And P.S., my mother is a retired educator. So I get to think about Otis and Rosie Brown when I think about how do you lead a company like TIAA, whose whole mission is anchored on people being able to retire with dignity and not in poverty.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that story. I think it's so inspiring, and I think a lot of people can relate to that, actually. And I want to dig in a little bit about, you talk about retiring with dignity. And the reality is, though, even though there's been headlines, and we've written a lot of these stories about Americans saving more during the pandemic than they did before, the reality is half of Americans haven't saved at all, haven't saved anything for retirement. And then within that, those who have, there are huge gaps. There are gaps between what women have at the end of their careers and men. They have a lot less. There are differences along racial lines as well, of course, and there's a lot that goes into that. But how do you address those gaps in thinking about your own experience and as in what you do?
No, I think as a leader, you always start with the facts. And as you said, the truth is 40% of all Americans will run out of money in retirement. And then when you disaggregate the data, which is why we can never get comfortable with the law of averages, because you'll never find where the real opportunities exist for that do better. And so when you look at the stats and you see that 83% of Black seniors do not have enough to retire, and you think about that circle impact, when that same parent is needing to be helped by their daughter who's also raising her kids, how are we going to shift the gap? So what do we do? There's three things that I would anchor on. First, we have to talk about the access gap. Secondly, we have to talk about the savings gap. And then lastly, I would say lifetime income solutions. And so when I think about the access gap, and clearly there's a lot of lack of access for so many, but I would say, a third of working Americans working in the private sector do not have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. That is an issue. And so how do we make sure with policy and working with other companies that we can make sure that more Americans have access to that employer plan? Secondly, when you think about savings, and I share that 40% stat, how do we make sure that we're providing opportunity for people to get on a path to saving, getting on a path to have companies match and contribute? And clearly, when you think about the pay equity gap for women, and you think about the pay equity gap for people of color, we have to understand that if we're not solving it on the front end, when we think about pay equity, and if we're not providing opportunities for mobility, then you'll get to that 30% gap for women. And so when we think about that savings gap, I think the opportunity for all of us as leaders is to really make sure we're disaggregating the data when we look at our pay by different levels, that we're looking at mobility by race and gender and ethnicity to make sure that all are able to have that real opportunity. And then we're making sure that we're doing all we can with technology and other levels of insights to help people get to that snackable action, that real next best action when you think about getting on a path to savings. And then finally, when I think about lifetime income, the reality, as I said, people are running out of money. And so how do we make sure that in addition to Social Security, which we know is not enough to replace your everyday expenses, how do we make sure that people have access to guaranteed income, which is something that we really focus on at TIAA so that people can never run out of money, I think is very important.
Thanks for outlining that to us. And just speaking of the news, last week the House passed the Secure Act bill. It's not passed the Senate yet, but that is supposed to address some reforms in retirement. Policy is one part of it, education is another part of it. But I guess for those who haven't been following the latest with the bill, will that really address, and what's in that bill, would that really address some of the gaps that you're talking about? What still needs to be added?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we know there's not one thing when you're talking about something as big as closing the retirement gap and making sure that all Americans can retire with dignity. But I will say policy matters. And what I will say is that the work that's been happening for years with Secure Act 1.0 and now 2.0 in a bipartisan way is a really big step. And so one of the things that we're hoping that will continue to complement the bill is to embed the ability to have access to guaranteed income within the default. And so punchline, great progress. Yes, it's a step. It's a positive step. And yes, we think there's a few more steps that can be done to really be able to make even accelerated progress in helping to close the retirement gap. But I do commend the work, and that it was done on a bipartisan way, I think is a great example of the work that has to be done to solve a problem that is definitely an American problem, not a partisan problem.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I want to talk to you a little bit about leadership in general. We've had a lot of conversations about the workplace so far, and part of what's next is, I think, what's next and what's required of leadership in this moment. And in this pandemic, a lot of companies have been forced to really evaluate, and we've had some great conversations in our breakout sessions about what's required now of companies as they think about how to retain, recruit, and support the employees that they need. And I guess how do you think, how has your thinking and your approach changed, in particular after these last 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we don't take a step to think about what has happened over the last 2 years. So we know the macro environment with the pandemic. We know there are wildfires on the West Coast. We know the murder of George Floyd. We know that maybe we learned for the first time that our children learn differently, and that we clearly are not equipped to educate our children on our own. But we also got insight into how people were living their lives. And if you all remember, for the first period of time, we all tried to act like we had it all together. We still wore our full suit. We still was like, life is good. And then we hit the bottom, unless I'm the only one. Did anyone else hit bottom over the last few years? And then at that point, the baby's popping up on the screen. You're looking a hot mess, and you're doing all that you can to keep it together. I share that insight because as we think about now, what is the next chapter of return to office, or how do we think about the workplace? We have to think about mental health. We have all hit rock bottom, and it had to be okay to not be okay. We all had to give the truth of trying to live our full life and recognizing that it's messy and that our boss and our colleagues experienced our mess. We also have to think about the fact of what choices did people learn that they love and that they don't want to give back. And so to me, when we think about the future, when I think about leadership, it's empathy. I think senior leaders have to bring empathy to the boardroom. I think with that empathy, we have to focus on how do we define our culture in a way that provides differentiation. And it's not just about, is it no days at work, 1 day, 2. If we only anchor on the count of the days, we'll miss the point, in my humble opinion, on what people are really saying. For me, it is about saying, how do we lead with empathy? How do we understand the backdrop and the impact of technology? And how do we provide a differentiated culture experience where people can feel like they don't have to compartmentalize work and balance life, which does not reconcile. And so I am excited to quite frankly, to say that I don't have all the answers. And I'm excited to say that we get to experiment, we get to try new things, but most importantly, we get to be really clear on who we are, what is our value proposition, and how do we make sure that we are equipping our frontline managers, the ones that are most proximate to our colleagues, to be able to listen, to be able to make sure we're listening and taking in that input, but also making sure that we can be agile. I think the biggest disruption that we have not yet experienced in our country or around the world is human capital. We have not really changed our practices, the way we have changed and innovated our technology, the way in which we've innovated our products and services. I think we have to innovate human capital around benefits, around work life, around how do people want to experience work, and how do we do that in a way that's accretive to delivering value for our participants, delivering value for themselves, and then ultimately delivering value for the larger community.
Well, I don't think I've heard too many CEOs before this today talk about empathy as much and mental health in particular. Yeah. So I do think that that's fascinating to share and super important. But I guess I wonder, today at least, I've heard a lot of women leaders talk about those things. Do you think women leaders are better at this? At this moment?
As a woman leader, I can say that for many women, we are not just leading a company. And even though, we have great support, my husband is a stay-at-home dad and super dope, but I'm still mom, which means, I still have a real important role that I cannot proxy away or delegate fully away. And so when we think about empathy and when we think about mental health, we're not just saying what we think, we're saying what we've experienced, and we're being open and vulnerable to talk about it, because I think that's where our strength lies. And so I do think that having women in leadership, and hopefully more than 41 running a Fortune 500 when it's all said and done, I think there are new perspectives, additional perspectives that women can bring, which is the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's perspective. And I know that being a woman, being a Black woman, being a woman running a company in raising children and trying to make an impact and taking care of the family and all the things that we do, I think that we can bring a unique perspective that will be additive when we think about culture. But the men can do it too. You just have to be willing to be a little vulnerable and get a little proximate to, you know, not being okay, not having it all together.
That's
it's
right.
okay.
You too, men, you can do it.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about representation, because I think that a lot of women do look up to you. They see who you are. You bring your whole lived experience, as we talked about, to your job. And this country has not just in the past years had the pandemic, but I think a big conversation, important conversation that's been elevated around racial injustice. And a lot of companies said a lot of things, threw a lot of money at this, but how are we doing? I guess what needs to be done, particularly from where you sit in terms of leadership at the C-suite level?
Progress is not a straight line. You know, pressure makes diamonds, and you know, I think we've all been under a lot of pressure, and so I'm hoping that some real good diamonds will come out of it. But when you think about the fact that there's currently only 2 Black women running Fortune 500, myself and Roz, and you think that the first was Ursula Burns, the CEO of Xerox, and that decades went by before the second and the third came about, you feel hopeful, you feel disappointed, but I think what we have to do is recognize that it is a mindset, and the mindset has to start in the boardroom, because ultimately the board decides who's going to run the company. And so I think it is important to make sure that the board has that diverse perspective or has strong allyship with an anchored mindset that talent is created equally, opportunity is not. And that the way in which leadership can show up, that there's different muscles that can be expressed that can ultimately run companies. So I think it is a mindset shift that has to take place in order to make real sustainable progress. I do think we can't just rely on the emotion of what we all had to sit and watch. That is not a unique experience, unfortunately, but one that we all sat and watched. Well, when the emotion fades and when the narrative shifts, what are we left with? We have to be left with disaggregating the data and recognizing where do we see opportunities. We have to then look at our practices and policies to say if we really want to have a different outcome, what practices or policies do we need to think differently about? And then lastly, what gets measured gets done. And that when you think about the commitments that we all have made, I think that we have to operate with intentionality. We have to understand that the job is not done in a quarter. The job will be done quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, and the reality is the job is never done when you're talking about progress. So my hope is that though we're not where we want to be, I do know that there are a lot more conversations happening. I do know that there's a lot more intentionality happening across all sectors, but I do think that we have to continue to hold ourselves accountable to saying if the real job is to make sure that we have equity, if the real job is to make sure that more people can have access to financial equality, then it cannot just be a moment in time that makes us get excited. It has to be part of the structure, the underlying chassis that says we're committed to doing the work. So more to be done.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed this conversation. It's been real, it's been inspiring, and really thoughtful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.